Welcome again, everyone, for coming to our sharing session this evening. So my name is Wendy. So I'm the CDC Child Development Center's Program Officer and Social Worker. So tonight we'll be sharing a lot about the Social Welfare Department services. And towards the end, I would also be sharing a few links and resources that I think might be useful for parents if you're looking into services for your children. So first of all, let's start with how to apply for Social Welfare Department services. So in my following presentation, I'll be referring to the Social Welfare Department as SWD for short. So a lot of the parents that we work with would ask if they don't have a Hong Kong permanent residency status, does that mean they're not eligible to apply for SWD services? So that's actually not true. So as long as you do have a valid legal status, so for example, if you do have a working visa, if your child is on a dependent visa and you are in Hong Kong legally, then if your child does have special educational needs, then you can apply for Social Welfare Department services. So how do we go about doing that? There are two different ways. So one of them would be through the government service. So this would be through the Child Assessment Center, CAC. So this is a service which the government offers for children under the age of 12. But then to apply for this service, you can expect the waiting time to be up to 6 months or up to a year, depending on which area that you live in, because you would register with different centers depending on the district that you live in. So then in terms of the follow-up, after you've done an assessment with the CAC, then they might refer you on for specialist medical services, for example, maybe ear, nose, throat specialists, different departments with the hospital authority. If your child is already older, for example, if they're 6 or above, then they might refer you on to the hospital authority. If your child is under the age of 6, then they would probably refer you on to the SWD for services. So these would be training and education centers partnered up with different NGOs. So then another way to do this would be through self-financed services. So you can go to private clinics or different NGOs which offer an assessment and or screening sessions. So it's very important that when you do call the different centers up, that you ask, most importantly, whether the pediatrician or the psychologist who's doing the assessment can fill out something called the Form 2. So this is the part where the psychologist, the pediatrician would have to fill out, where you take that form and you go to a social worker who would then help you to refer on for SWD services. So the pediatrician and psychologist would also be making recommendations on which SWD service would be the most appropriate for your child. So in terms of going to a social worker, you can go to sort of different centers in your local area. So for example, Integrated Family and Children's Services. So that would be one of the best centers to go to get a social worker to help you refer on. So there are also other NGOs where they offer services where they already have psychologists and pediatricians on site and also a social worker. So that would be CDC, we would be one of them. So we do offer free screening services done by one of our clinical psychologists or educational psychologists. After the screening session, they would then give you verbal feedback and also recommendations. And most importantly, if your child does meet the criteria or eligibility for referring on for SWD services, they would then also let you know which service they recommend. And then I would then sort of come in and also talk to you about the referral process and what we have to do to then refer you on. So what are the different services offered by the SWD? So I'm pretty sure you might have heard different acronyms. So for example, SECC, EETC, IP, OPRS, TSP. But what do these acronyms actually mean? So SECC refers to a special childcare center, and RSCC is residential special childcare centers. So most of the time when you bring your child to our center or different NGOs for assessments, you would then be looking at a special childcare center only. So typically residential special childcare centers are for children who may have been put up for adoption, or maybe their disability is so advanced that they aren't able to live at home with their parents. So EETC stands for Early Education Training Center. IP stands for Integrated Program. OPRS stands for On-Site Preschool Rehabilitation Services. And TSP refers to Training Subsidy Programs. So so the government has partnered up with different NGOs to then support with delivering these services. So for example, at CDC, we offer EETC services and also TSP as well. So there are different services. What do each service then entail? So in terms of SECC, these are centers that support children with moderate to severe disabilities. So as I mentioned before, residential special childcare centers are for children with very severe disabilities, or perhaps they've been put up for adoption. They would then enter a residential special childcare center. So this service would start from newborn up to the age of 6. Whereas for a special childcare center, it would only start at the age of 2. So it's only a service that starts at the age of 2 up to the age of 6. So in terms of services provided, it is a full-time center-based placement. So this means that it would completely replace a mainstream kindergarten setting. So in terms of an SECC center, they would typically have an occupational therapist, physiotherapist, registered nurses, speech therapists, special childcare workers, and social workers as a center-based staff. EETC, it's sort of split into 2. So from newborn to the age of 2, if you might remember, if you apply for a special childcare center, your child has to be at the age of 2 before they can be enrolled into a special childcare center. So before the age of 2, if your child, for example, maybe they are premature babies, if they're at risk of becoming disabled, for example, then they would be referred on to the EETC center first. So at this point, the focus would mainly be supporting parents in terms of like the different roles within the family, how they can then support the child's development until they reach the age of 2. At this point, they would then see whether they can remain in the EETC sort of setting, or whether they would still have to move on to a special childcare center placement. So in terms of service, this would be center-based and most likely once a week. So this would have occupational therapists, speech therapists, special childcare work, and social workers as well. But different centers might have different staff or professional staff on hand. So I do encourage parents to then call up the individual centers if you're interested in applying, just to ask them what sort of professional staff they have on their staff board, and also what sort of how do they then offer the service? Because sometimes they might be able to offer individual services, sometimes it might be group. So it really depends on the different centers on how they then offer the service as well. So in terms of OPRS, so this is on-site preschool service. So this would be kindergartens that have already partnered up with different NGOs, where the NGO would then send a team of professionals into the school to then support the children, the staff, and also parents. So most likely this would be twice a month, so every 2 weeks. A team of professionals would come into this kindergarten, so it might be an ST, OT, or a special childcare worker. It could be direct service with your child, so maybe 20 to 30 minutes. And then the other time they might be going into the classroom, supporting the teacher as well, on how could they then support your child in terms of the learning within the classroom. And they would also support with sort of like different talks for parents, and also training for teachers as well. So the other thing to note is that although this is called an on-site service, there are times where you might have to go back to the center of the NGO. So for example, if they've identified your child might be needing some sort of sensory input or sensory integration training, and they might not have that facility at the kindergarten, then you might have to travel back to the center to do the training. So depending on the NGO, it might be that the center is not near where you live. It might even be in a different district completely as well. So this is something very important to note. It might be that you have to go there once a month. So you might want to take that into consideration as well. So again, do call the social worker in terms of in the kindergarten, just to double check how do they offer the OPRS service. Do you have to go to a center, or is it all just center based? So in terms of the team, they would most likely also have an occupational therapist, maybe physiotherapist, speech therapist, special childcare workers, and social workers as well. And they might also have a clinical psychologist and educational psychologist as an outsourced service. So they might, if they identified some needs, they might invite a CP, a clinical psychologist, or an EP, an educational psychologist, to come into the kindergarten to then support as well. One thing to note as well, so because like I mentioned, it's kindergartens partnering up with NGOs, so your child would have to be at the age of 3 to receive OPRS service. So before that, you would then also be referred for an EETC placement as well. So for integrated placements, so this would be for children with mild disabilities. So this could be hearing or sight with mild disabilities. And then this would actually be a training and care program integrated into a mainstream kindergarten. So this is slightly different from the OPRS team, where there is a team of professionals coming into the center or the kindergarten to support your child. The integrated program is there will be a special childcare worker on site where he or she would be responsible for 6 children, and they would then create a curriculum or a program that is suitable to your child's needs, and then that would be integrated within the kindergarten. So this could be in the format of individual sessions, group sessions as well, and also, of course, within the class setting as well. So the last one would be TSP. So this is the training subsidy program. So this is slightly different from the services mentioned above. So this service is only for children who are already on the waiting list, but they are not yet been allocated the services mentioned earlier. So we'd actually go into more detail later on. So I would just leave this as it is for now, and then move on for a bit first. So like I mentioned, each NGO and each center would or may offer services differently. So for example, at CDC, our EETC service is offered as a group program only. So the maximum capacity of the group would be 6 children. And then sort of the flow would sort of be like floor play or like free play first, where every week we would have a different theme. And when children arrive, there would already be toys set out on the mat where they could then play for a bit first, before we go into circle time, where all the children would gather back with our special childcare workers, and then they would do sort of like show and tell, maybe different songs relating to the different themes that we have. And then we would go into station time, where our children will be broken down into smaller groups, so maybe 2 in a group, and then they would each go to respective stations of a special childcare worker, an OT, which is an occupational therapist, and also ST, speech therapist. So in terms of within station time, our teachers would normally work with children in terms of their cognitive abilities. So for example, maybe numbers, alphabet, maths. And then it might be literacy or numeracy as well, depending on the level or ability of your child. Our ST would then be working on social and communication, and our OT would be working on the fine motor skills and or pre-writing skills for our children. So after station time, we would have sort of like motor games. Depending on how the occupational therapist might be sort of structuring the group, they might be bringing children into our motor therapy rooms, as you can see in the pictures, to do training. But if not, they would also be bringing equipment into the classroom for gross motor training as well. So then we would also have group games. So that would be led by our speech therapist, where they would engage children in more like social elements of, for example, different games and role playing, etc. So normally that would be how our EETC programs would be run. But it would be according to different children's needs, of course. And then we also do assessments biannually. So every 6 months, we would have an assessment and also a report where our teachers would then also invite parents back to discuss the findings of the assessment or what is written in the report, answer any questions that you might have, and also give you further recommendations on what you can do maybe at home, as well as what we would be doing in the center as well. So that would be how we offered our EETC service. So then in terms of coming back to the referral, what happens after you've seen the psychologist, you've seen the pediatrician, and you've already spoken with the social worker, you've decided which service you want, and the social worker has submitted the referral. What then happens? So then we would actually receive something called a Form 1B. So that would be a confirmation of registration. So this would actually arrive at your referring social worker's office. So the SWD would send this piece of paper directly to your referring social worker, and your referring social worker would then pass this on to you. So this Form 1B is actually very important. So as you can see on the form, there would be your child's name and also like their documents, etc. So there are 3 things that are very important to note on this form. So the first one would be your child's reference number. So it's called a P number. And that would be the reference that if you do call up the social welfare department, or then reach out to the different NGOs to then check sort of the status of your waiting time for your child, etc. This reference number would be the number that you refer to. The second one would be the date of application. So this is very important because the social welfare department actually allocates placements according to the priority of application dates. So sometimes I would advise parents, because we don't have access to each center's sort of like waiting list or waiting time. The actual center actually don't have access to this information as well. So if you do want to find out or try and work out how much longer you might have to wait before your child does get services, I would recommend parents to call up the center and ask them, for the last child that they've admitted into the center or the service, what was their application date? From there, you can then sort of work out roughly how much longer your child might have to wait before they get selected for placement. So the last important bit of information would be at the bottom of the form. There you would be able to find who your referring social worker is. So in terms of all the questions that you might have regarding your application or the status, etc., you can then find their information there, their name, sort of like their office, and also their contact number as well. So after we get the confirmation, the Form 1B, like I mentioned, when your child does get selected for placement, the SWD would actually contact your social worker directly, and your social worker would then contact you to see if you're still interested in accepting this placements or the services. So while you wait, because that could be a bit of a long waiting time, especially because there are only 2 centers in Hong Kong that provide English-speaking EETC service. So one of them would be us at CDC, and the other one is an NGO called Watchdog. And in terms of special childcare centers, there is only 1 center in Hong Kong that provide English-speaking services. That center is in North Point, and it's operated by the Tonghua Group of Hospitals. So as you can imagine, there's only 2 centers and also 1 center that provide this service in English. You can expect the waiting time to be very, very long. It could be up to a year, if not more. So then there's also something called transitional services that is offered by the SWD as well. So in terms of transitional services, the first one would be Tier 1. So Tier 1 is slightly different to the ones that I would be mentioning later on, purely because Tier 1 is a service that is offered by the SWD for children who are waiting to be assessed. So these are children who have not yet seen a psychologist or a pediatrician, and they have not gone through that referring process yet. So these are typically children in kindergarten where that kindergarten does offer OPRS services. It could be that the teachers have seen or observed the child having maybe some needs, needing some support, or it could be parents approaching the teachers and also the social workers saying that they do have some concerns in terms of the child's development. And while they wait for an assessment with CAC or while they wait for an assessment with a private center, they can access something called the Tier 1 service. So this is not OPRS service. It is actually less. So the idea is that your child does get some support while they wait for services or while they wait for the assessment to determine what placement or what support your child needs. So the other services that I will be mentioning would be services that you can only access once your child has been referred on to the SWD. So the first one would be the waitee service. So this service would be for children who is waiting for OPRS services only. So this would be once you get the Form 1B, your referring social worker would then send documents over to the OPRS team, who would then be supporting your child. And while you wait for the OPRS service, because they might not have a place for your child immediately, you can receive something called the waitee service. So that this could be a bit more than Tier 1 service, but again, that would really depend on how the OPRS team offers this service as well. So once you get waitee service, you can only choose to accept waitee service or Tier 1 service. So you can't actually have both services at the same time. So the other two would be called the transitional OPRS and transitional EETC service. So these are for children waiting for an SCCC placement only. So while you're waiting for an SCCC center, you would be eligible to apply for a transitional OPRS or EETC placement. So these placements would be exactly the same as if you're receiving an OPRS permanent placement or EETC placement. So the idea is that while you wait for SCCC, your child would still be receiving services. So the last one would be the training subsidy program. So this would be while your child has been referred on to the SWD, you have received Form 1B, and while you wait for either OPRS, EETC, IP, SCCC, any of the mentioned services, this is a free of charge service offered by the SWD to try and bridge the gap of the wait. So there are 2 types of TSP. So one of them would be the high level. So the high level TSP would be for children who are waiting for an SCCC placement only. So the minimum requirement set out by the social welfare department would be 6 one-hour sessions per month. And within that, 3 of those hours would need to be provided by a therapist. So like I mentioned, this is a completely free of charge service until your child does get allocated an SCCC placement. So the other one would be a normal level TSP placement. So for a normal level TSP placement, your child would either be waitlisting for an EETC placement, OPRS, or IP services. So in terms of the normal level placement, it is means tested. So the SWD have set out sort of like a income test in terms of like how much, if you exceed that income line, then you're not eligible to apply for the service. But if you are, then you can apply, and the service that your child would receive is 4 sessions of 45-minute sessions per month. So there is no requirement from the SWD in terms of how, which professional would be conducting these services. So different from the high-level TSP. So all 4 of those 45-minute sessions could be provided by a special childcare worker, so like a teacher. So in terms of when you apply for TSP, I would strongly recommend parents to call up the center that you're wanting to apply to and ask them exactly how the TSP service is provided. Because, for example, at CDC, our TSP service is offered in the format of group sessions only. So similar to our EETC, the maximum capacity of the group would be 6 children. And in terms of our high-level children, we offer 2.5 hours per week as a format of group sessions, where the rundown would be similar. It would be led by one of our special childcare workers. There would be station time, gross motor game, and also social games as well. In terms of normal level, we offer it as a group as well, and then it would be once a week for 2 hours. So in the group, there would also be a special childcare worker, an ST and OT. So for us at CDC, regardless whether your child comes to us as a high-level TSP or normal level TSP, they would, every time they come, they would always see our teachers and also ST and OT as well. So once your child is in the TSP program, and when you do get allocated, for example, you're in the high-level TSP, at the same time, you can still apply for transitional OPRS, transitional EETC, while you wait for your SCCC placement. So say, for example, your child is already in high-level TSP, and your social worker contacts you and say, oh, you've been offered transitional OPRS. Do you want to take up the offer? Or they might say, your child's been offered transitional EETC. Do you want to accept the offer? So at this point, you would have to decide and pick which service you want. So it is okay if you remain in the high-level TSP program and sort of like reject the transitional OPRS and transitional EETC. That is okay. It would not affect your place or your line on where you're waiting in terms of for your SCCC placement. So you would still be waiting for SCCC and receive high-level TSP and reject transitional EETC or OPRS. So that is possible. And then on the other hand, if you've been offered sort of normal level TSP, you're already receiving services, and then your social worker contacts you and say you've been offered EETC or OPRS. So be careful, this is not transitional services. So when your child was initially referred, they were being referred to an OPRS or EETC placement. So at this point, you would still get a choice. So you can choose to remain in the normal level TSP or move over to the EETC or OPRS sort of like placement. One thing to note, if you do decline the EETC placement or OPRS placement and remain in TSP, you cannot then say, oh, actually, I want to go back and I want the EETC service now. So once you've rejected the service, if you do want to reapply for the service, you would have to resubmit the forms. And then it would be, if you remember, I mentioned something called the application date. So if you do reapply, it is very likely that your child would get a new application date. So you would then have to wait for the service all over again. So the other thing would be when children get allocated for SCCC placements, you can decide to stay in high-level TSP. Again, you would have to be really, really cautious when you do this, because when you do this, that would mean that your child would then lose that SCCC placement. And if you do decide later on that actually my child does need that full-time support, then you would have to waitlist for that service all over again. So this is something to be very mindful of. Normally, I would encourage parents to talk to the social worker and understand how the service you've been offered is being how they would then offer the service, sort of exactly what service in terms of profession would be offering or delivering the service, and then comparing it to the service that you're currently receiving. And also speak to the therapists and teachers that are currently supporting your children within the either TSP program, transitional OPRS, transitional EETC, etc., to get their opinion and advice as well on what they recommend would be the most suitable for your child as well. So if you do choose to remain in TSP, like the other services, you can then remain and decline the permanent placement. And this would be the same for all services. The service would stop once the 1st of September of your children turning 6. So for example, if your child turns 6 in May, that does not mean the service would stop in May. So that would be your child turning 6 in May, and then it would be until the end of that academic year. So it could be July or August, depending on how the NGO operates. And also, if your child moves on to primary school. So for some children, if they move on to international schools, they might move on at the age of 5. So once they move on to primary school, even if they're 5 years old, the service would also stop there as well. So some of the frequently asked questions by parents is, how do I know which service is most appropriate for my child? So if you remember way back at the beginning, to be referred on to SWD for services, you have to be seen by a psychologist or pediatrician. So once they've seen your child, once they've had a chat with you, they would give you their recommendation and their opinion on which service is most appropriate for your child. So another thing would be, I've applied for one service, but I want to change to a different service. Is that possible? So it really depends. So sometimes parents, maybe they've chose OPRS, but then later on they think, oh, actually, I want to do EETC instead. Is that okay? So that really depends on two things. So one of them would be whether your child has already been admitted into a service. So for example, if you're wanting, if you applied for OPRS and your child has already been accepted into OPRS and started services, but then you think, actually, my child needs EETC service. At this point, you would then need to go back to a psychologist or pediatrician to get them to do a reassessment to see whether they do agree that your child does need EETC service, or if not, maybe SECC even. And then at that point, your referral social worker would then have to submit an application for you again. One thing is that you would be able to keep the application date. So if you remember, the social welfare department allocate placements according to the application date. So as long as you're still within the service, you can keep the application date. The other one would be if your child have not been allocated services yet. It would really depend on when your child was seen by the psychologist or pediatrician. If it is within 6 months, and when the pediatrician or psychologist, when they made the recommendation, they did recommend both OPRS and EETC, then you won't have to go back to them again. Your social worker would be able to change the service applied for you. But if you want to make that decision after 6 months, or the pediatrician or psychologist did not recommend both services, then you would have to go back to them and get a reassessment or see them again to get the Form 2 filled out again, then go back to your social worker, and then they then resubmit an application to the SWD as well. Even if we do it this way, your child would still be able to keep their application date. So if, for example, you're in TSP, so the training subsidy program, the one that I mentioned earlier, and for example, you've been offered EETC, and you're applying for a normal level. If you then decline the service and you then want OPRS, from the social welfare department standpoint, you might already have been removed from the waiting list. So in that case, when the social worker do resubmit the application for you, it is very likely that you won't be able to keep the original application date. So then you would have to waitlist for the service all over again. So another question that we often get asked is that my child is already 6, but he is going to be repeating K3 in the upcoming academic year. Can he or she still continue to receive SWD services? So for this one, it really depends on two things. One of them would be whether you have seen a psychologist and pediatrician and whether they did also recommend this. And the other one would be whether the OPRS team or the EETC or the SECC, or the IP program, whether the centers or the NGOs have the space or the place for your child in the upcoming academic year. So if they do, and if you do have supporting sort of like documents or letters from a pediatrician or psychologist, your social worker can then submit an application for service extension to the SWD. And then it is then up to the SWD to decide whether they would grant the service extension or not. So often they would look at whether your child has been receiving, how long have your child been receiving services? So normally, if they have been receiving services for less than 6 months, then they might be more lenient maybe. But for example, if your child has already been receiving services for more than 6 months, then they would require a very strong reason as to why your child does need to continue to receive SWD services. So one of the sort of reasons or one of the arguments could be that you are a low-income family, for example, and you don't have the resources to then support your child if they don't have any SWD services. So we've talked a lot about government services offered by SWD. I would like to share different services offered by maybe NGOs and also different centers as well. So of course, there's always self-financed or private clinics where you can approach, because then when you do get assessed by a psychologist and pediatrician, normally they would also give you recommendations apart from which service is the most suitable for your child, but also what training or intervention does your child need. So for example, it might be ST, the speech and language therapist, or an occupational therapist. It might be in the format of a group where they need to practice their social skills. Many different options and many different sort of like recommendations as well. You can then call up different self-finance or private clinics or different NGOs and to see whether they do offer that service and also, of course, what their costs may be, etc. So if you can see at the second point, there is a link. So this is a website or a resource that is very, very useful. So if you go to this website, there is a toolbar at the top where you can click on resources. And from there, you can then input sort of like the age of your child, the area of service that you need, and maybe the residential district or area. And then they would then generate a list of different private clinics or NGOs as well that do offer this kind of service. And then from there, you can then bring up different centers or read up on the website to try and find out whether that center or that service is useful or appropriate for your child. So the other one, the other thing would be if you do call them up, sometimes if you might not be able to access the services because of finances, you can ask them whether they offer financial assistance, for example. So some NGOs do offer this support. So for example, at CDC, we do offer this service as well. So for low-income families, if you do have a child with special educational needs and you don't have the resources to then support your child in terms of self-finance services, we do offer financial assistance. So you would have to fill out a form declaring your income and also different expenses that you have. And that would then directly go to our CE for approval or like review. And then she would then decide whether we're able to support your family in terms of how much assistance we could provide. So it ranges from full subsidy to maybe 60 or 80% as well. So another website would be another link to different services as well. So you guys can have a look. So I know this is a lot of information to take in, but don't worry, the slides will be sent out to you guys after the presentation as well. And of course, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them now. But if not, you can always give us a call or like send me an email, and then we could have another chat as well. But for now, does anyone have any questions for me? You can feel free to unmute yourself or type in the chat box as well.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thank you very much for your introduction and then everything. Sorry, I dialed in late, so I missed the first 20 minutes. But can I ask that you mentioned we have to take our kids to the pediatrician to get the report to submit the application? And do you have any list of a pediatrician that we have to take her, or any pediatrician is okay?
Yes. So I would recommend if you have a clinic or a GP that you already go to, you can ring them up and see whether that pediatrician could do that assessment for you. So the most important question to ask is whether they could fill out a Form 2.
Oh, Form 2.
Yes, that's correct. So another way would be you can contact different NGOs, for example, CDC, because we do offer a free screening service where the screening would be completed by one of our clinical psychologists or educational psychologists. And after that, if they determine that your child does meet the criteria or eligibility, then we can refer on as well.
Oh, okay. So basically, we have to bring the Form 2, and pediatrician will help to bring.
Sorry, I couldn't hear the last part very well. Could you repeat that?
Yeah, sure. So we have to basically bring a Form 2 for the assessment, and the doctor will help to fill in the forms whether the kids need help or not.
So you would contact the pediatrician, so they would actually have the forms already. So it's not something that you have to bring to them. So they would fill out the form. If you go to a pediatrician or a private clinic, if they don't have social workers, you would need to take the Form 2 and go to, for example, an integrated family services center and ask a social worker to help you refer. So there are two parts to the referral. One of them would be for your child to be seen by a psychologist or pediatrician. And the other part would be you have to be referred by a social worker. So you need both parts as well.
Okay, understand. Thank you.
No problem. Okay, so if anyone else have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself or type in the chat box. But in the meantime, if you could please complete the feedback form, that would be much appreciated. So I would be staying on for another 10-15 minutes as well. So feel free to send any messages or unmute yourself if you have any questions.
So in this talk, you mentioned a psychologist or a pediatrician. In my case, my kid, I think she has speech delay, so it's really specific to that. So is the general procedure to still see a psychologist first, or
yes,
could it be speech therapist there? Thank you.
Yeah. So unfortunately, in terms of if you do want a referral for SWD services, your child has to be seen by a psychologist or pediatrician. And ST can't fill out the Form 2, like I mentioned, so they can't help with the referral.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. We've got a message in terms of, is the information available on the SWD website? Yes, so all the information that was mentioned today, it is available on the SWD website. So when we do send out the slides, I have included the links to the different services. So you can just click on the link and then it would lead you directly to the different sections of the SWD website. So we got another questions about what is the difference between Tier 1 and weighty service in OPRS. So in terms of Tier 1, This is before your child has been seen or assessed by a psychologist and or pediatrician. So WAIT service is your child has already been seen and you've already been referred for SWD and you are already waiting for OPRS. So in terms of the specific service offered for Tier 1 and WAIT service, you can expect it would be a lot less than OPRS. But specifically how it is offered in terms of the hours and the training, you would have to contact your kindergarten and ask the social worker directly because each team does offer that slightly differently. So we did get a question about parent sharing that the child has been recently diagnosed, and what are the pros and cons for OPRS versus EETC. So typically, parents do choose OPRS for maybe convenience sake, because it is a service offered at the kindergarten already. But typically, EETC does offer a bit more service compared to OPRS, because EETC, all the service hours are direct contact hours and direct service to your child. Whereas OPRS, I think I did mention before, the team does go into the kindergarten and they do offer some direct contact hours to your child, maybe every 2 weeks for about 20 to 30 minutes. And other times they would also go into the classroom and support teachers as well. Those also count as service hours. And also sort of like hosting like talks for parents, etc. Those also count towards service hours as well. So if you do have an EETC center in mind that you do want to sort of like apply to, I would encourage you to reach out to that center and to ask them what sort of how do they offer the EETC service, and then also asking the OPRS team what direct contact hours of service would your child receive. And then you can then sort of make a comparison in terms of the contact hours and also who would be delivering those sessions. And so EETC, yes. So it is, so your child would go to the center and it is direct contact hours for your child only. So then you can then sort of decide which service or which center you would prefer for your child to go to. Let's see. In terms of CDC, for our screening, we don't actually give out any diagnosis and we don't have any reports for parents after the screening session. So at most, the psychologist might let you know or advise that your child might be suspected to have ADHD or suspected ASD. But if you do want a diagnosis or if you do need a report, for example, then you would have to go for a full psychoeducational assessment, which is more in-depth and comprehensive. And only after that would our psychologist be able to give you a diagnosis or report. So OPRS is a general program, or it is a service that is provided by different NGOs. So depending on the kindergarten that your child goes to, they would then have already partnered up with a specific or a certain NGO. So the service would then be provided by that NGO that the kindergarten has partnered up with. So it depends on which NGO your kindergarten partnered up with. So it doesn't have to be, or it won't necessarily be watchdog only. It could be different centers might be like Keep Hong or like Pull and Cook, etc. Those might be more like well-known NGOs as well. So it is different NGOs, not only Watchdog. Health center, maternal and child health center. So with these centers, normally, I think they can sort of do a screening, but then afterwards, they would then refer you on to CAC for assessment. So from a maternal and child healthcare center, they wouldn't be able to then refer you on. They would then refer you to a CAC for assessment and then refer on for SWD services. Thank you so much. So like I mentioned, if you have any sort of like concerns in terms of your child's development, or if you have any questions about our screening services or assessment services, feel free to contact me. Or if you have any questions about our EETC service, TSP, or other self-finance programs as well, feel free to reach out anytime and I'll be happy to help. Thank you so much to everyone for coming tonight. I hope it is informative and helpful and useful. I shall see you all soon.